It let me do it.
Oh, great. That is great. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this Trauma Symposium. We are so glad you are with us on today. I am the Reverend Dr. Barbara Wilson. I'm the Director of Collaboration and Community Partnerships for the Presbytery of Chicago. We serve approximately 84 congregations in Northern Illinois. We are glad to be co-conveners with McCormick Seminary for this Trauma Symposium series. And Dr. Stephanie Crumpton, would you like to greet us?
Hello, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. We have been in this series since April. My, how much has gone on since then. And we have had the wonderful joy of being here with you all and talking about trauma, not only about trauma, but also about practices and strategies and deep engagement around faith. I'm so excited about our panelists this morning or this afternoon in some places. I'm going to be in and out a little bit, handling some technical difficulties for a little bit, but I'll be around and hopefully will be fully present in just a few minutes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Stephanie. Well, as those of you who have followed with us, been with us since April know, we seek to offer trauma webinars that are science informed, the neuroscience, that are practical in terms of implementation on the ground, and that are spiritually engaged. And so that's our formula. Today, we are so pleased to welcome Ainslyn Pulley. And Ainslyn, I'm working on saying your first name correctly, so you could always correct me. But Ms. Pulley is co-executive director of the Chicago Torture Justice Center. And that organization defines mass incarceration as a form of trauma and introduces the Torture Justice Center's specialized response to victims of police torture. Along with Ms. Pulley, we will then have a presentation from Cindy Eigler, co-executive director of the Chicago Torture Justice Center. And she will introduce the concepts of politicized grief and healing and give practical examples of the organization's healing work. And then, since the technical difficulties will be resolved, we certainly are praying and hopeful. We will hear from the Reverend Dr. Harold Trulier, who is the Executive Director of Healing Communities USA. And he will share with us concerning the role of faith and spirituality in our collective understanding and engaging the civil rights issues of mass incarceration and criminal justice reforms. And so he will bring biblical reflections and African-American historical connections to this conversation, and also congregational responses that are being implemented from Healing Communities USA. Now, each of our presenters will have approximately 20 minutes to offer their presentations. We are inviting all of you to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A section of the platform. And with that, we shall dive right in and we turn it over to Ainslyn Pulley. Ms. Pulley, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is not very easy to pronounce, so thank you for a gracious attempt. It is pronounced Ainslyn, but you know, I understand. It's not a very common name. So I am going to begin by talking about mass incarceration and its link to trauma and a form of trauma. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about the Chicago Torture Justice Center. I want to begin this conversation by using a quote from a friend who is a great thinker, writer, a therapist, a somatics practitioner, and someone who is a dear friend of the Chicago Torture Justice Center, and their name is Prentice Hemphill. And Prentice teaches us that oppression is the organization and distribution of trauma. And that quote is something that we reflect often on at the center, and which helps us understand our politicized healing lens, which Cindy will go into in depthly, and the focus of our work. So with that quote in mind, I want to begin to dive into the rise of mass incarceration. In 1955, criminal justice expenditures at all levels of US government, local, state, and federal, amounted to about 0.5% of the US gross national product. From 1971 to 1974 alone, spending on the criminal system jumped over 42%, from $10.5 billion to about $15 billion. As of 2020, the total expenditure has increased to $300 billion, which represents an increase of 1,900%. This is based on the US federal statistics. However, in a study by Washington University in St. Louis, incorporating the true social cost of incarceration increases this amount to $1.2 trillion, or 6% of the gross domestic product. Over the past 40 years, the prison population in the United States has grown sevenfold, thereby placing the United States in a unique historic distinction of incarcerating more of its population than any other country on earth in history, in number, and in percentage. The US criminal system currently holds 2.3 million people in 1,833 state prisons, 110 federal prisons, 1,773 juvenile correctional facilities, 3,134 local jails, 218 immigration detention facilities, and 80 Indian County jails. This number does not include military prisons, civil commitment centers, state psychiatric hospitals, and prisons in the US territories. The US locks up more people per capita than any other nation in the world, at a rate of 698 per 100,000 residents. The majority of people incarcerated in the US are in custody in state prisons, totaling 1,291,000 people. And that should be understood as particularly important because there is often an emphasis on private prisons, which represent approximately 2% of the total incarcerated population. The overwhelming majority of people incarcerated are in state-controlled prisons. The second largest segment are held in local jails, and that is totaling 631,000 people. Of that amount, the majority of those people have not been convicted of anything, so they are being held pre-trial without conviction. That number is 470,000, or 75% of the US jail population. And so that is a very staggering number and is a very unique number amongst the world. 75% of the US jail population has not been convicted of anything, but is in jail because they are too poor to post money bond, which connects to the very, very important movement to end all forms of money bond, which essentially are poor people's taxes. In the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander states that by the end of 2007, more than 7 million people in the United States, or 1 in every 31 adults, were behind bars, on probation, or on parole. And that's as of 2007. 2020, we know that that number has not drastically changed, but has increased from that. This then brings us back to Prentice's explanation that oppression is the organization and distribution of trauma. Articulating it in this manner opens up opportunities for us to understand the consequences of incarceration and the systems that uphold it beyond financial considerations, beyond the sterility of statistics, and allows us a more deeply opportunity to examine the consequences of incarceration on the psyche, on the person, on the family, on the community, and ultimately on society as a whole. Prison, as a direct source of trauma, is lived out absolutely. We struggle with language to encapsulate how broadly trauma is integrated into every aspect of the carceral state. It includes the absolute complete subjugation and removal of agency of the person. It implements and systematizes methods of torture and normalizes them as tools of coercion at the absolute whims of authority. Solitary confinement, which has more recently become known and accepted as a form of torture, is a widespread method of punishment used in the United States, and uniquely used in the United States as a widespread method of torture. It is also classified by the United Nations as torture. Solitary confinement produces in people who experience it intense feelings of anxiety, paranoia, delusion, memory loss, hallucinations, and other perceptual distortions. Albert Woodfox was a former Black Panther and was released 2 years ago, was forced to live in solitary confinement in a small 6 by 9 feet cell, alone for 23 hours a day for over 40 years. For 1 hour a day, when a person is in solitary, they are taken to a small cage outside with the opportunity to walk in circles before being taken back in. The enormity of what this has on the human psyche is enormous. Human beings are social. We know scientifically that babies who do not receive enough human touch can stop growing, and if the situation persists, can actually die. Touch, love, and human interaction are central to our survival. Language inspires neural connections in the brain and produces and promotes neuroplasticity. All of these things are intentionally prevented and obstructed through incarceration, both in its mildest forms as well as in its most extreme forms. In addition to solitary, incarcerated people experience sleep deprivation, sight and temperature fluctuation. These things can produce loss of sight, hearing problems, and delusions and hallucinations. People exiting from prisons have to work to adjust to sound, to outside light, to understanding and relearning to recognize sensations in the body like hunger, because the agency of incarceration is designed to withhold all of those things. So that's a small sample of some of what we learn about and hear about as some of the normalized conditions of incarceration in the United States that are routinely systemized and are used widespread throughout the country. The Chicago Torture Justice Center was founded in 2017, and we were founded out of the 2015 Reparations Ordinance for Survivors of CPD Torture. A conservative count confirms that 120 primarily Black and Latinx people, men and women and children, were tortured under the auspices of former Chicago Police Commander John Burge over a span of 3 decades. This torture was used to elicit confessions. After decades of fighting by survivors, exposing the torture, finally The truth about the breadth of the torture ring began to come to light in the early 90s, resulting in John Burge's firing. In the early 2000s, with the advent of DNA testing, that was used to exonerate dozens and dozens of people who were scheduled to be executed. That prompted, including many torture survivors and many people directly tortured by John Burge. That resulted in the Governor Ryan, issuing a moratorium on execution. A few years later, the Illinois legislature completely abolished capital punishment. In 2014, John Burge had been sentenced to prison, not for torture because the statute of limitations had expired, but for lying about it, for obstruction of justice, and was sentenced a paltry 4.5 years. For torture survivors, for attorneys, for family members, for people who had fought for some semblance of justice, this felt like a slap in the face. And so what the community did was gathered together to figure out, what can we do? What would reparations actually look like for survivors and for families? And came together and created an exhibit. And in that exhibit included a draft reparations ordinance. That reparations ordinance inspired activism and organizing. And we held actions, teach-ins, train takeovers, developed curriculum, and in 2015, we were able to amass enough pressure to force Rahm Emanuel to pass the country's first reparations ordinance for survivors of police torture. That included a number of transformative elements. It included a small monetary amount for survivors, but more importantly, because the money wasn't enough, and it is never enough, it also included 4 other very important and transformative elements. The mandating of teaching about torture and police violence in Chicago public schools in the 8th and sophomore years, and this is the now 4th year that this has been implemented in CPS. The creation of a public memorial, which Lightfoot has committed publicly to funding this year during her tenure. Rahm did not. And free access to all Chicago city colleges for torture survivors and their family members. And lastly, the creation of a center located on the South Side dedicated to servicing and providing treatment for survivors of torture and all police violence, thereby creating the Chicago Torture Justice Center. That then allowed the creation of the country's first and currently only center dedicated to domestic torture. This is something that we should be very proud of as having fought and won, but we should not be the only. And the only reason why we're the only is a direct result of the organizing, the massive organizing that forced this into creation. This work has allowed us to understand more deeply the full breadth of consequences that happen after the state violates, traumatizes, brutalizes, and tortures individuals. That trauma is not only felt on the individual level, but is felt on the familial level, the community level, and societal level. We have been honored to be the first, and we know that we should not be the first. So we are doing this work with the intent of it being replicated, not only throughout the country, but throughout the city. Cindy is going to walk through the work of the center as it relates to trauma and healing. And I want to offer a quote that will begin to bridge some of what I discussed in with how we understand the politicized nature of our healing. And this is by Bessel van der Kolk, who is the author of The Body Keeps the Score. Mm-hmm. Trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perception. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but our very capacity to think. We have discovered that helping survivors of trauma find the words to describe what has happened to them is profoundly meaningful, but usually is not enough. The act of telling the story doesn't necessarily alter the automatic physical and hormonal responses of bodies that remain hypervigilant, prepared to be assaulted or violated at any time. For real change to take place, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. Therefore, that's the end of the quote, but therefore, when we say that our politics are healing and that our healing is political, we are specifically talking about the need to treat trauma directly and to dismantle the systems that create the trauma. It is not enough to name where the source of trauma is coming from, but it is also necessary, and it is also healing to ensure that that trauma is not replicated. And so therefore, our work is to heal, and part of that healing work is also to dismantle mass incarceration and all forms of state and police violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pulley. I just need to name the comprehensiveness, and that word doesn't really get at what I'm saying. What you've laid out for us is not only the economics of mass incarceration, but you have humanized and deeply the breadth and length of what it means to be human, and you have helped us understand the word trauma and what that concretely looks like through mass incarceration and torture. And I just want to thank you for that. And so we look forward to hearing now some of the ways in which your organization has rolled out programs for treatment and on the ground. So Cindy Eigler, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for having us and for creating space for this conversation. I think Aislinn ending with that quote from Bessel van der Kolk was perfect, because before I go into the center's work, I do want to spend a little bit more time kind of unpacking that and how we are thinking about trauma, because it directly informs the work of the center. And I think you'll be able to see all of those connections. I know that when I first began on my pathway as a politicized healer, I used to think of trauma as somebody's just individual experience. Somebody had an experience of trauma, maybe it manifested in depression or anger, maybe physically as violence or substance use, but it was going to be best addressed in a room with a licensed therapist in regular kind of 50-minute sessions. And over time, my understanding of what trauma looks like has really shifted. Now I have an understanding, and the center has an understanding of what is happening in our bodies and our nervous systems in response to trauma, and also how trauma relates to the collective, right? Usually when we've been hurt or endangered, what our bodies do is prepare us in case that harm comes again. So we're just constantly waiting for the next bad thing to happen, and our body, all of our biology is preparing for that. And at the same time, as Aislinn mentioned, we're social animals, right? So on a deep and biological level, we orient towards cooperation and connection in order to survive. But we also know that trauma most often occurs in human relationships, right? Which then triggers our automatic response to protect ourselves from people and connection. And what that looks like and how that shows up in our work and in incarceration in particular is it creates an inherent conflict in our basic needs for both safety on the one hand and then connection on the other, right? Leaving us that we often have to choose between one or the other. We need safety or we need connection, but we can't have them both. Some ways that can look, and I imagine most of us have seen this in our interactions with folks all around, it can be an aggressive connection, right? I'll be safer if I push or attack, or I'm ready for that. It can be an appeasing connection. I'll be safer if I just let them have their way. Through isolation, right? I'm just gonna stay by myself, so I'm safer in that way. You could say, I don't matter, only you matter, so you're prioritizing other folks. or only I matter, you're not as important, or there's bonding in trauma. So, and especially I think this is something we see with folks who are traumatized by mass incarceration. I'll only be safe and connected if I stay close to the trauma or the person or situation that hurt me, or that context, right? But in this conversation, we're talking about trauma as associated with mass incarceration. Aislinn did a great job of laying that out. What I want to reiterate before I start talking about systemic trauma, which is, I think, when we're talking about mass incarceration, we're talking about systemic trauma, is that I think it's important to remember that the vast majority of folks who are incarcerated, their first experience of trauma did not start with incarceration, right? It didn't start with arrest. So what we're talking about is trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. I know as part of the trauma symposium, you covered ACEs. Like, we know how early trauma starts, and we also know it can start, it's generational, right? So that we're talking both about systemic trauma and also people's own traumas that they've been kind of amassing over time. But with mass incarceration, I do want to name it as a form of systemic trauma in particular, and just focus in on that a little bit. The way that I've seen systemic trauma defined is that it is repeated, ongoing violation, exploitation, and or deprivation of groups of people. Systemic trauma can overwhelm and break down safety, connection, and dignity in our minds, bodies, and spirits, both individually and collectively, right? And so when we talk of the trauma related to systemic oppression, what's really important to note is there's no post, like in PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. There's no post, it's ongoing, right? So it's an accumulation of trauma, meaning that our body is on alert or hypervigilance all of the time. There's no letting down, there's no ability to do that. And that has a real physiological effect on our bodies and our chemical kind of makeup. We often lose the ability to accurately read whether something, someone, or some place is safe or not. And really, in order to survive, oftentimes our bodies will read everything as a threat, which again is really exhausting, both mentally, but also physically. There is a really somatic impact to that. The other things I want to name just about trauma in regards to mass incarceration is that sometimes trauma is a collective experience, in which case the healing must also be collective and communal. And I think you'll see that when we go into the framework of the center, that we practice healing on both individual and collective levels because of that. And that people who are incarcerated not only have these traumas over traumas over traumas that they had before even their incarceration, and the systemic trauma of incarceration and all the dehumanization and violence that Aislinn described, but they're also experiencing almost constant secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, because they're constantly watching and seeing other people in their environment being traumatized and dehumanized. I also want to just mention, and Aislinn talked a little bit about safety. And I think that that's a piece that we don't oftentimes talk enough about, I think, with regards to trauma. Trauma and oppression have a profound impact on our experience of safety and our ability to generate safety, right? And that's what we need to relearn and rebuild, a lived sense of safety. And that's a lot of the work of the center. So some of the ways that trauma impacts our experience of safety is that our attention can be pulled externally to find safety. So it's like, it happened once, it might happen again, I better keep watch. That fight, flight, freeze response will naturally bring our attention outside of ourselves as we're constantly working to assess danger and figure out how we need to be moving in protection of that. And oftentimes what happens is our attention gets frozen externally, like that, right? That's a physiological reaction. Our attention is always focused externally, and we lose the ability to relax back in within ourselves, to be able to notice what's happening in our bodies, how we're feeling, what we care about, etc., because there's that external focus. There's also another thing that we see with regards of safety is that we can often look to other people to feel safe. So it's if this person, situation, or environment would just be or act like I want it to, then I'll be okay. And what happens usually is that strategy is fundamentally disempowering and usually not very successful. It can create reliance, it can create a lot of isolation, or inspire even like codependence or kind of manipulate controlling relationships. And what it really does is disconnect us from each other, right? So it doesn't allow for the kind of transformative, deep relationships that help one be able to generate safety. And then the last thing I'll say is that sometimes our thinking and embodied experience split. And I think we can all see this a lot. And we've seen this particularly with folks who have been incarcerated and spent a lot of time in a really dangerous situation is that part of that split is a survival mechanism, right? So it might show up with feeling, I feel fine and safe in what is fundamentally a dangerous situation, right? That's our body's way of responding to our own experiences of how safety is being impacted. Or it can be the opposite, which we also see a lot, particularly for folks coming out of prison, is a feeling of in danger in what is then maybe a safe or positive situation, right? So one of the things that happens as a result of the trauma associated with mass incarceration is that we often lose our ability to assess safety, right, for ourselves and for our folks. So we know those things, and we know that trauma is not something that resolves quickly, and it's an ongoing, non-linear journey, right, over time. And I think Asen mentioned really clearly how how mass incarceration robs us of our agency. And that is very much an impact. Trauma robs us of that feeling that we are in charge of ourselves, right? And so some of the challenge, and this directly informs the work of the center, is how do we recover our ability to establish ownership over our body and mind, right? How do we get to practice that? How do we get to feel that? How do we get to experience that? And before I'm going to move right into the framework, because I know people are curious about the center's work, but looking at Bessel van der Kolk and other leading experts in trauma, they've talked a lot about different ways to address systemic trauma. And those are usually ways that we don't think about, right? It's not in the way that I had mentioned in the beginning of sitting in a therapist's office for 50 minutes a pop once a week, right? That's not what they were talking about as what they've seen to be effective and successful. Some of what they say, and all of this is reflected in the center's work and directly informs our work, is that ways to address systemic trauma is to create opportunities to help others and to be in community and relationship with others and support. So we can have experiences of staying positively connected to even just one person, or experience of what is it to feel and to be allied with, to be supported, or to be protected by others, right? And to be able to be in that kind of relationship. To create opportunities to make greater meaning and purpose of what happened. So a lot of the work in our Speakers Bureau is how do we connect individual experiences of trauma to the larger collective experience and to the systemic and structural factors, right? How do we make greater meaning and purpose? It's also creating opportunities to reconnect to our imaginations, right? Increasing our ability to imagine positive and sustaining futures. I know one of the things that really impressed me, because I didn't realize this maybe 6-7 years ago, how much trauma actually impacts our ability to imagine anything different, right? And separates us from our longings, from our desires. And so part of our healing journey is being able to reconnect to that, reconnect to what we care about, reconnect to what we want for ourselves. Obviously, creating opportunities to decrease isolation is important, but also helping to give skills for folks to develop boundaries that they get to set. So it's increasing self-determination. What are the boundaries that I need to feel safe, and I get to set them, right? That's really important. And then there's all kinds of collective exercises that are in many of the books and articles that these leading experts have talked about, but they include collective movement, drumming, humming. It actually changes our neurobiology. So it's not just something nice to do with other folks, but it actually creates shifts in our neurobiology as well. And then the last thing I'll name, because I think it's important, both in the work of the center, but also in thinking about trauma as related to mass incarceration, that what we want to do is not shame people for their survival strategies, right? Which is often the way that we're taught, is that this is a habit that we had or a behavior that we have that is bad. It is bad. We are going to do something different. But instead, what we're saying is that these are behaviors or patterns or things that we have because we have survived, right? These have kept us safe. They have kept us alive. And we want to honor those. We want to name them and we want to honor them. And then we can ask those questions. Do these still serve us? Do we still need them? And we can develop a broader range of choice so that we have more moves that we can make, right? But we definitely want to honor those things, because I think one of the things that's deeply I can't think of the word, but mixed in, right, with trauma is shame. And so a lot of the work is also how do we address that? So for the center, as Aislinn named, the Chicago Torture Justice Center, we work with anyone impacted by directly or indirectly by police violence. So most of the folks that we work with are either formerly incarcerated. We are also in correspondence with about 100 currently incarcerated folks. And most people have some kind of involvement with the criminal justice system. And the best way I thought to go through our framework of our work, we've just been recently working on our theory of change document. So it kind of lays out how we are thinking about the work. And I felt like it might be a good way to talk about it. So one thing that we say around state violence is that we say state violence is not only physical and direct, but structural, cultural, and systemic, with long-lasting psychological, economic, and environmental impact, right? It's embedded in institutional racism and compounded by intersecting systems of harm, such as sexism, ableism, racialized capitalism, misogyny, xenophobia, heteronormativity, and transphobia. And the Chicago Torture Justice Center responds to these experiences of state violence by co-creating opportunities to holistically heal, individually and collectively, while dismantling structural systems of oppression and creating new systems of care and accountability. So what you might be able to pick up from that, our focus question as part of our theory of change is a lot around self-determination, right? How do we co-create? How do survivors get to say what they need? How do we do that both on an individual and collective collectively, while also asserting our power to dismantle those systems, right? And ignite our imaginations to be able to create new systems of care and accountability. How do we want to be in community together? We know that state violence is produced by and perpetuates historic institutionalized racism. We know that it causes long-lasting and complex trauma. And we know that the trauma, whether it's experienced directly or indirectly, requires a culturally appropriate, expanded definition of what healing looks like, that again is determined by the survivors, right? So our strategy or our framework is really what we have started to refer to, or been referring to in the past year or two, as a politicized healing framework. And as how we define that is that we believe that our healing is political and our politics can be healing. Our politicized healing framework addresses and seeks to transform the harm felt by individuals and communities caused by historic and evolving systems of oppression. Through the practice of politicized healing, we work to engage in a self-determined process of restoring ourselves and connecting to others and what we care about, unapologetically expose and deconstruct systems of harm, and build reparative powers that realize new paradigms that we collectively imagine for our communities. So that's our politicized healing framework as a whole. And I think as we describe that, again, you'll see reflected the themes that both Asen and I touched upon around self-determination, finding our power, unapologetic truth-telling, building community connection and relationship, igniting imagination. And those things are all reflected in almost all of our programming. We do more traditional forms of clinical support or therapeutic support. So we have clinicians on staff. We offer one-on-one counseling. We offer case management support because we understand that there's a lot of very immediate, real needs that people need for their daily survival. And then we have an array of other programming. So we have just recently been working with actually Dr. Crumpton on this politicized grief series. And our first offering out into the community was a Boxing as Healing video. And we had been doing boxing in person, led by one of our learning fellows pre-pandemic, but then we put together this video and a worksheet. They're both accessible online. That really can remind us of the healing and power that is always available to us right here, right now. So right through boxing, and we were just shadow boxing, we get to fight for our yeses and for our nos. We get to say what we want to fight for and what we don't want anymore. We get to feel our aliveness and our power fully. We also have a Freedom Songbook program that we've been doing in collaboration with Old Town School of Folk Music, where we actually get to be in collective song together, which, as I mentioned before, really actually does have impact on our neurobiology. And it's a resilience practice, right? It builds resilience, it brings connection, it brings joy. And we talk about joy often as being an act of resistance, right? And so we bring that into a lot of the work of the center. And as part of the Freedom Songbook program, we were able to develop this protest anthem, right? And so that we have this anthem that really represents our stories, our truths, and we can make those, put them out for others to be able to participate in. We also have a speakers bureau. I think I mentioned that before. So people are able to speak their truths out in community and have a very different felt experience of what is it to say my truth, where it is heard, where it is accepted, where it is affirmed, where I'm, it's a very different experience than most of the survivors that we work with have had. And that's a very important part of the work of the center as well. We do a variety of body work or use did a variety of body work pre-pandemic, including craniosacral therapy and acupuncture. And we also have a Survivor Family Advisory Council that leads all of our organizing work. So as Aislinn mentioned, we need to dismantle these systems that cause harm. So we are actively working to free the incarcerated torture survivors. So there's about 100 who remain incarcerated. We're actively doing work around the consent decree, around the defund CPD campaigns. There's a lot of work that we're doing to try to bring attention to what is happening and disarm that. And then we're trying to put all of these resources out and accessible to everyone else. So I think as Aislinn said, we happen to be the first. We don't want to be the first. We definitely don't want to be the only. And so part of the work of the center is how do we start talking about this framework and making our resources available and accessible to a wide variety of people. So we have workbooks, zines, we're putting together trainings that we'll begin to be offering out in the community that really help us expand our understanding of what healing can look like, and who gets to have it, right? Not only who gets to have it, but who, it's not something that we need an expert for always outside, right? It's like, how can we connect to our own power and our own sense of what we care about and our own healing in that way. So I think I might stop it at that. I did loosely mention our politicized grief. That felt like it was going to go in a whole nother direction. So I'm happy to answer questions at the end if people have more questions about our programming. There's so much different work going on. So I feel like that might be a good space to end it.
So Cindy, I just want to name something before Dr. Stephanie jumps in, which is, you said something that's really important. You said a lot, but one of the things is that persons have to rebuild a lived sense of safety, right? And so it will be wonderful to learn more going forward about the resources for those of us in community, no matter what part of community we are living in, because how do we, as we engage together, become allies that co-create the connections and the space for persons to rebuild their lived sense of safety as a part of that recovery of trauma. That's critical. So I want to thank you for naming that in particular. Stephanie?
Thank you so much, everyone. Cindy and Aislinn, your presentations have been spot on, incredibly educational. One of the things that and Barbara, you just touched on it just now when you mentioned the notion of allyship. And then I also want to want to lift up how when I hear Cindy and Aislinn speak about the work that the center does, the language is our, right? That we're working as allies, we're working in community, there's not a them, us dynamic that is happening. And I think that that's really critical as we think theologically about what does it mean to build communities that hold full truths. And one of the ways in which we can, as faith communities, look at that is think about what is the role, particularly of faith communities, in partnering in this kind of work with organizations, nonprofits like CTJC. And for that reason, we have Reverend Dr. Harold Trulier with us this afternoon to talk about the work that happens, that he has dedicated his life to, working as the executive director from Healing Communities USA. Dr. Trulier, can you tell us a little bit about how you come to this work and also the work of Healing Communities USA as we consider the role of faith communities in being allies and partners in the communal work of engaging mass incarceration and responding to trauma?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Yeah, Healing Communities starts with the assumption that every church has somebody who has a family member in the criminal justice system. We all know what the numbers look like, and it's literally numerically impossible that your church does not have somebody that's currently in the criminal justice system. It may be hidden, there may be shame and stigma surrounding it, to keep us from knowing, but numerically it's virtually impossible. So we start with the assumption that at the local church level, there's somebody who is currently in the system. I came to this work Actually, it's interesting. The way I came to this work was I was asked by a predominantly white evangelical missionary organization to work with kids who were in the system in Paterson, New Jersey. And the next thing we knew, we had a new principal at our high school, Joe Clark. They made a movie about us, Lean on Me, with Morgan Freeman. And it exposed in a very, very real way just how the criminal justice system was impacting African Americans. But beyond that, teaching in predominantly white theological schools, we came to understand that this was not a Black problem, but this was, a United States problem. And so we developed the Healing Communities material that would help churches reduce the shame and the stigma around incarceration. We produced material that would enable congregations to understand that this is their problem. We looked at the number of people who are in the scriptures who are incarcerated. Joseph, Daniel, Paul, John, and people who would have been incarcerated under current conditions, like Moses, who killed his friend's boss, or David, who killed his girlfriend's husband, if you want to put it that way. To try to normalize and regularize behaviors that we today consider criminal, and look at the ways in which the church can respond and be present for people whose behavior has been criminalized. And so in our work with Healing Communities, we start with reducing the shame and stigma. We help congregations connect with the people in their churches who have somebody in the system. We encourage congregations to do altar calls for families of the incarcerated. And at that point, once we've identified people, the idea is just to be the church, to walk with them, to stand with them, to understand what they're going through, to deal with what psychologists called disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is the sense of loss that an individual has that's not been credited. Churches have ways of dealing with grief when it comes to death. We have funerals, we have wakes, we have viewings, all rituals that respond to people who are dealing with grief. But we don't have anything in place to deal with the grief that a mother has or a father has when a child is arrested and goes to prison, or a parent that goes to prison. And so our commitment is to helping congregations, and I apologize, I got caught in the rain the other day and I have a cold. Helping congregations to walk with people through the grief that they feel with a family member who's been incarcerated, and helping them to not only walk with a person who is dealing with incarceration in the family, but begin to understand some of the social and political implications of incarceration, so that they'll be in a position to be advocates for policy change. You know, our belief is that once a person comes to understand how difficult things are for incarcerated persons, that they will understand the policy issues that incarcerated persons feel. Sentencing, prison conditions, etc. And that in understanding the trauma that people go through in incarceration, it will lead people to make to recognize that we need to change the policies that are behind mass incarceration. Again, I apologize, my throat is very sore. But
That's no problem.
that's what we do at Healing Communities. If you have any questions, you can ask me.
Okay, how about we give your voice a break? Because it looks like we're really glad that you're here, but it looks like it's a little tough for you right this second. So let's give your voice
I can barely hear you.
I said, how about we give your voice a break? We're really glad that you're here, but it sounds like we might want to give your voice a little bit of a break, and maybe also some of the questions that may come in, it might be more useful to put them into the chat, but we're going to work with you because we need you, first of all, to be healthy.
Okay, thank you.
We need you, first of all, to be healthy. And so we're going to give your voice a break and kind of move into some of the Q&A that we might be getting some conversation and pieces that are coming in on the chat and also listed in the Q&A. So we're going to mute you for a second. I hope you get some water or some tea to take care of yourself. One of the favorite things that happens at the center is that the work that I'm doing with the center, I'm learning is that they prioritize bodies. So if you need to get some tea or get up and walk around, do what you need to take care of yourself, please do that. We fully understand. And so I think one of the things that I do want our listening community to think about, based on what you heard so far, is as a community of theological education and also as a community of faith, right? Because theological education is about faith. What are some of the ways in which you become curious about the highs and lows of responding to trauma? So that this is a question that I'm asking for our gathered community, as we're also part of our normal community for the McCormick Theological Seminary Trauma Symposium in partnership with the Presbytery. We also have people who are here from McCormick Days. And so what I'm inviting the gathered community to think about is when you consider all that's been laid out by Aislinn and Cindy, Dr. Trulier, what are some of the highs and lows that you are thinking about in terms of joining with people like, or organizations like Healing Communities and CTJC? And if you can start to put those questions and comments there into the chat or the Q&A, that gives us some fodder, some things to start thinking about. But one of the first things I want to talk with Cindy and Aislinn about is, I think it's kind of it's an opening question. What are some of the most, what are you most excited about in what you're seeing in your work? And also what makes you most concerned, right? As you think about the role that communities, faith communities, persons of faith, right? Because I think it's important to acknowledge that there are institutionalized faith communities like a particular congregation, but then there are simply people of faith who may want to join in this work. And so what are your greatest excitements about what this work can begin to look like as more people join the center in their politicized healing and grief work? And then also, what are some of the things you're most concerned about, and that in terms of what you've seen with people with whom you're currently working with, as well as this current work is existing within the larger context of what's happening here and now? I know there's a lot of questions, but I know y'all got it.
I can start off if you want, Aislinn. I think So I'm going to also answer somewhat broadly, but one of the questions that we often ask at the center when we have this politicized healing framework where we name our politics as healing and as and our healing as political, is we ask this question of really recognizing that we ask the question of who does it serve when we are unwell, right? There's an agenda that is served when we are unwell. And then on the flip side of that question is what becomes possible when we are well. And I think that that's what I'm most excited about, is that if we have communities, because we also don't differentiate between different types of trauma, like this is real, this isn't real, this is more serious, this is less serious. We know that we're all impacted by these systems that are trying to kill us in different ways, and particularly targeting certain communities. And so I think introducing these practices that allow us to connect back to what we care about, to connect back to our power, to our fullness, to our wholeness, and embarking on that kind of healing journey together as a community, I think so much more is possible, right? And the idea of what would be possible if we were able to connect to our imaginations and to our whole gifts is really exciting to me. And that's not just the work of people who are coming to the center, that's our work, that's everybody's work, to be able to do that. So I'm really excited about that. I think the thing that is a concern, and this doesn't live just in the faith community, but there's such a pull, the dominant narrative of this country is really to focus on personal responsibility, kind of the individual person, right? And that's what we've been taught, and that's how we've been taught to talk about things. That's what a lot of our programming in prison is all about, that, right? You only get parole if you can say, I did the thing, I'm responsible, right? And all of the free AA, NA programs that are wonderful, but that are offered are all about taking personal responsibility. So there's this real emphasis on that. And I want to be careful, because I know it can be controversial, not to say that we don't have any agency and power and we don't want to take any responsibility. But what concerns me is a quick move to the personal responsibility without a recognition of the systemic and structural violence that is supporting everything and allowing everything to thrive. And this level of harm that we're seeing all the time to continue so much. So I think really my push would be is to help get people to constantly be commenting and connecting the personal to the systemic and the structural, and thinking about what needs to be built. Because if we take it as a personal responsibility, our solution will be a personal one, right? And that's not going to shift anything in a systemic transformational way. But if we really start naming the systemic and structural violence and the way that looks like, it shifts what we're going to be coming up with for ideas.
Cindy, that's so powerful. If I could jump in right quick, Aislinn, it looks like you're about to say something. I think what you just said was so powerful. And I think for faith communities, I think the important thing is to think theologically about the parallel theologically, right? That there are ways in which, in terms of our faith, we can only be praying about and advocating in our faith lives around our personal experience with God. And to the exclusion of the community, and also saying, God, if you would just do this for me, as opposed to saying, God, can you do this for the community? And furthermore, can you empower us, not me, but us, to collectively work towards the wholeness that some might identify as salvation or the coming of the reign of God? And I think that's important in a theological conversation, that there's some theological wrestling that communities of faith need to do to be able to keep up with the concerns around pinning this on the individual without looking at the systemic. There's a way in which the faith community, theology can move in the same way, that it's an individual faith as opposed to a collective faith engagement of the concern. Just wanted to jump in there with that. Aislinn.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that I'm both excited and nervous about. So some of what excites me the most is the ability in doing this work. It is the ability to imagine beyond. Imagine beyond what we thought was impossible. And so it really feels like we're at, as Miriam Kaba calls it, the horizon, striving toward the horizon of abolition, and understanding more fully the breadth of policing as it exists right now, the full breadth of incarceration in the carceral state and system as it exists right now, and the multiple overlapping effects that it has on life, both, you know, societally, as well as down to the minutia in terms of individually, our outward facing actions, as well as crafting our internal worlds, and how we understand ourselves in relation to the outside.
Mm-hmm.
So that very much excites me, because it opens up the possibilities of then imagining and giving language to what could exist, what kind of systems could exist that actually nurture life, that nurture harmony. What does it mean to envision an abolitionist society
Mm-hmm.
that's free of the carceral state? Forces us to complicate how we understand harm, why harm happens. And so that is very, very exciting for me. My fears are also many, particularly because of this moment. The potential for an increase in incarceration, specifically targeting organizers.
Mm-hmm.
What will happen if this election is contested? You know, so there are many things, many worries and anxieties that I have there. Sorry, my phone is ringing. I don't know if you can hear it.
That's all right.
And what specifically in regards to the faith community, the way that mass incarceration has occurred in this country is that it has accompanied, you know, and has risen at the same time as the rise of the neoliberal economic doctrine, which replaces the prior economic ethos of the world, which was the Keynesian ethos of economics. And it promotes privatization. And what that has meant in terms of the carceral system is that many programs that existed no longer exist. Educational programs, wellness programs, etc. But the ones that do exist, in cases where everything else has been done away with, are often religious based. And so there, and it's because of what Cindy talked about, which is the emphasis on personal responsibility, and the way that and the way that I've seen that used is in people using religion to say, I have sinned, right? I'm the sinner, and therefore I'm looking for redemption. And now, please allow me to show you how I have redeemed myself through correctional facilities. However, there is an important role there that the theological community can play, which is to enter in and to use that space to bring in expansive and innovative thinkers, to bring in programs that counter the doctrine of the carceral system and of mass incarceration, and to use the examples of the so many liberatory theologians who have incorporated concepts of freedom and liberation in their work, and which pushes back against you know, the coercive influence of the state to confine it only to the personal.
So I'm really appreciative of this, because both of you are reiterating, along with Dr. Trulier's comments, the importance of people of faith, whatever our faith perspective, whatever our values and principles, our willingness to dig deeply and live more deeply into what we say we believe, this thing of who are we becoming, and not just myself, but as the collective. And so the need again for our willingness for innovation, creativity, flexibility, and to find those things as a part of our theological and our faith perspectives, and not simply for us, but with others. And so I want to thank you both. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. The first one that I invite you to respond to says, help us think about the impacts of incarceration and detention on top of trauma asylum seekers, bring with them from what they have fled. So what would you have to say about the impact of incarceration and detention on top of trauma that asylum seekers bring with them from what they have fled? Any thoughts at all?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I have much. I would say that, so there's the Kovler Center here in Chicago. I know not everybody is in Chicago. That's a torture treatment center that's for international torture survivors. And there's a consortium of about 14 centers across the country that serve international torture survivors. And they're prohibited from providing services to domestic torture survivors, because we don't like to think that that's something that happens in this country. Mm-hmm. And that question makes me think of them. So we've worked with the Kovler Center really closely to try to learn, as we were developing our program model, where's the learning we could have. They have such a rich history of working with torture survivors and folks who are seeking asylum in the United States in particular. And so I think that there's a lot of similarities in a lot of the torture survivors that we're working with, and the asylum seekers, in terms of what the trauma looks like, that it is political, it is systemic and structural, it is a form of systemic trauma. We know that it's ongoing, so it doesn't matter that they're in a different country and that there's new traumas on top of that, right? So it's a different, being in a place where you don't speak the language, where everything is different, where if you're used to seeing mountains and all of a sudden there's no mountains, that actually does something to our ability to feel ground under our feet and home. So I think there's other levels of trauma and impact that happen from fleeing your country. And on the other hand, the difference that we've seen from the most part is that for the survivors that we work with, they talk all the time about being at Walgreens and having a police officer stand up behind them in line just to buy some Cheetos or something, and what it does to their body, like how automatically they freeze, their heart starts palpitating, they start sweating. So in Chicago, because it's one of the most heavily policed big cities in the country, there's no hiding from the source of this trauma, right? It is around us all the time. And I think that's that's different for asylum seekers, right? If they've fled the place where their experience of harm was or the threat was, but they're encountering all kinds of different challenges here in a new place too. So I don't know that the services would be very different. I think that we've listed in our definition around making sure that things are culturally appropriate, is like, what are those things that make sense for somebody, depending on where they're coming from? How do we make sure they're able to have access to somebody who speaks their language, to the things that they need? I don't know if Aislinn, you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I guess I would add I do want to just say clearly that asylum seekers who experience detention are included in our conception of people who have experienced policing and state violence, right? So, they are a part of the population that we include in our perception of our work. I will say that I think, as Cindy just explained, that experience of, and I'm thinking specifically of asylum seekers who are then detained, which has exploded, did not begin under Trump, but has certainly exploded under Trump, then enter into the realm of what of what Cindy just mentioned, which is a sense of being in perpetual exile, and in a perpetual state of possible capture, which is very similar to escaped slaves. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's the sense of never truly being able to relax. And so I think, you know, that experience is shared in very similar ways, and then is compounded perhaps, you know, by not understanding the language, not understanding, you know, the social norms of this country, of coming in from a different country, etc. But then that is also replicated in incarcerated people returning to the outside world after decades of incarceration, who are having to learn this new world. And many survivors have talked about feeling like they entered into a new planet because things had changed so much. So I think there are many similarities there in just learning how to acclimate, and a perpetual feeling of not being safe by the state.
So I'm most appreciative because once again, both of you are naming the need to not compartmentalize, right? This is this trauma, here's this trauma, but we are naming what is similar and the distinctives about trauma. And so theologically, faith communities, we have a choice, right, to not only increase our understanding, but not to minimize, and it's not competitive, whose trauma is worse, right? And so our willingness, how we see ourselves and the other based on our faith perspectives, we would hope would inform allyship, would inform how we are willing to engage and respond. So we have a couple of more questions in the Q&A. The person says, difficult time to frame this question, but it relates to the church community especially. But even how the penal system will always focus on the personal responsibility and accountability that's built into our collective mindsets. And all of you have spoken to that. The question is, it says, however, it feels like this is a brain learning that often does not connect to the heart. How do we change hearts in the process? Any thoughts about transformation of the heart?
I think for me, in the trainings and the politicized healing trainings that I've been a part of, it is very much heart work. And I think that there is a didactic way of let's spell out the history and this is how it lives. But a lot of the work that we're doing and why we ground in the Soma in particular is to be able to see how do these things actually show up. The systemic and the structural do not just live out here. They show up in how I am with myself, what I believe is possible. They show up in how I am with my daughter and with my son. They show up in how I am at the center and in community and in movement and so on and so forth. And so I think a lot of the work that we're doing is to really we'll talk about what it looks like outside, but then do the work of how does it actually show up in our own bodies and in our own actions, and at what cost, right? And does that align with what we actually care about? And so there's a lot of that work that we're doing is like really reconnecting to what we care about, seeing how these systems have been internalized and making shifts around that. And because that does become heart work in a very different way, because it's in our bodies. I don't know, Jason.
That was an excellent answer.
We would agree, and we can find the bridge to previous webinars in that this is, maybe it's a matter of the will, right? Because you all have presented the historical pieces, the science piece, and so to the degree with which we are willing to receive and embrace the accurate information, the correct data, and look at ourselves and see the impact on ourselves, my goodness, well, maybe that will be a part of the bridge to help me understand collective trauma and its impact. One more question. How do we change legislation to expunge records of those non-violent offenders and those who have served their time? That's a targeted question. How do we change legislation to expunge records of those non-violent offenders and those that have served their time? Panelists?
So I've been involved and am involved in many lawsuits, which seek to then become like law, including the consent decree. among other things. However, I think the role of the law is sometimes imbalanced in its importance. And what is the largest barometer of change is organizing and mass movement and creating the political crisis that then forces people in positions of electoral power to then enact changes. Without that movement, without the organizing work, then they're just drafts of paper. There has to be a movement that supports it and that is calling for it. And we've seen that with it, thousands of times in history, right? With the Civil Rights Amendment, all kinds of lawsuits have been filed, and it's only when there is uprising of some sort, outcry of some sort, that these things then are carried through. So I would say, regarding that specific question, the movement needs to continue and to build, because there are many pieces of legislation that can get passed and then are ignored. And we've seen that time and time again. We've seen judges do illegal things. Gerald Reed, who is a torture survivor who's been in prison now for 29 years, who was tortured so severely that he's now in a wheelchair. His case was thrown out by a judge who then retired. And this was December 18th, 2018. That judge retired, and then the judge who took over it, who was supposed to set bail and bond him out so that he could be released, postponed doing that for an entire year. And then on Valentine's Day of this year, threw out the prior judge's ruling, sending Gerald Reed back to prison. He did this knowing the law. He's a judge, knowing that a co-equal judge cannot do this. It's an illegal move. However, the only way to reverse that is to go through the appellate court. And that's a process that typically takes 3 to 5 years, pre-pandemic. With the pandemic, it's even longer, right? So it's not just having the legislation in place or having an ordinance in place, it's also having a movement that is going to ensure that this is carried out.
That's awesome.
Can I add one thing to this, just because I think we have an audience that we don't normally have, so I just want to throw this in there, because I think it's important, is that, so I had a mentor who talked a lot about the power being held up. It's Fanon's kind of theory around power being held up by fraud and force, right? And so we can see the force. We're talking about state violence and structural violence in all its ways. But the fraud is, what are the ideologies, which include theological ideologies that exist, right, that allow the powers to sustain and thrive, right? And some of that is inherent in this question. And I've been doing criminal justice organizing for 20 years. So it took me maybe 10 or 12 years till I figured this out. Because I was able to work with this mentor, is that when we say the words nonviolent offenders, what are we saying? So much of our legislation and so much of our work always focuses on that. And that what we're actually uplifting is the dominant narrative or the dominant ideology that some people are worthy and some people aren't worthy. Why would only nonviolent offenders or people who have a nonviolent offense be able to get their records expunged? And so that's there's no judgment. I'm not trying to shame anyone, but I do think it's important to really name that we have to really think about also everything that we're doing, everything that we're saying, what is the ideology that it is bringing forward, and is that an ideology that we can stand behind?
Cindy, I really appreciate you inviting the possibility of theological communities doing a particular kind of work. I think, and you named it well around ideology. I'm gonna go a little further in on it from where I sit in theological education. I think part of, because there are two questions that are related. There's what Isla mentioned around, in response to how do we do this, it's about engagement, it's about organizing, right? And there was a previous question of how do we change hearts? Well, the two are connected, and I think that they hinge upon what is your theology, right? If you are holding and or if you are formed by a theology that says that there's a very punitive dimension of God, right? And that your sense of righteousness is individual, and that your sense of righteousness is primarily about your relationship with God, but not as much about your actions with others, right? Then there's a way in which we don't feel theologically, faithfully, spiritually required to respond to the pain of others that are particularly influenced by the justice system. Another part of it is your theology, does it prepare you to engage the justice system, right? There's an interesting way in which faith communities can have a heart to want to alleviate suffering, but there isn't the theology to undergird it, because we haven't done, and for many reasons, have not done the work of grappling with what we've been told about is our role and what prophetic work is supposed to look like. We've emphasized a lot of the priestly dimensions of ministry, but not as much of the prophetic work, and kind of separating the two out. But the question I think that I wrestle with, and that I hope the theological gathered community will wrestle with as well, is in our priestly dealings with communities and our relationship with God, does that then compel us towards outward engagement, which is indeed prophetic? And I don't mean just prophetic in speech, but I mean prophetic in being willing to wrap our arms around people and get involved, and not understand it as a work of charity, but as a work of community, as a work of wellness and wholeness. Because there's a way in which, again, the punitive theology that says that those who do wrong, right, that there's nothing but God to deal with them, and if they fall on hard times because they did wrong, then they shouldn't have done wrong in the first place, right? There's a very Deuteronomistic kind of way in which our theologies can get in the way of us having full hearts as we engage, because we can engage, but there can be the tone of the engagement, right, can become problematic. And especially when it gets deep and we have to really get into it, there's a way in which we haven't let go of wanting to punish people, right, even after they've done their time. And in particular for the folks that you all are dealing with, these are people who didn't do anything. They were tortured into making confessions of things that they didn't do, but there's still kind of the ideology of the state that says, if you did it, you get what's coming to you. And so the question becomes, how can we grapple with matters of grace and accountability at the same time? And not just extending grace towards others and holding others accountability, but willing to receive the grace, right, that those who have been incarcerated extend to us by allowing us to participate in their lives, right, and also allowing them to hold us accountable. You know, a lot of times we want to say, we want to hold, yeah, but there's a way in which there has to be a shift in the power balance between faith communities and people of faith and those with whom they develop and receive and are allowed, right, to participate in. There's a way in which we assume that people who have been incarcerated, we have a right to their space. We have a right to help them. But that's not really true. No one had, but that punitive idea of how to structure relationship can become the issue that needs to be addressed theologically. And I think that's where there's work to be done. I won't say there's an answer, but there's work to be done in terms of changing hearts that can then fuel long-term engagement, right? Not just, we did it, we showed up, we were there at the rally, or I mean, relationship building. I think sitting in those spaces of looking theologically, the inside work that we as faith communities have to do to be able to be responsible in our engagement and partnership with organizations like CTJC and Healing Communities USA. And with that, I'm going to take a
Stephanie,
break.
Before you jump, I just want to I want to lean in a little further and say, sometimes the degree to which we won't do those things internally in our faith communities, we typically don't do that, holding ourselves accountable in the ways that you're speaking, where we are looking at how we're engaging internally, and are we doing just what you said. It makes it awfully difficult then for us to extend that outwardly when we are not internally doing those things.
Thank you. Yeah, heal thyself first. Let's start there. And I close out by mentioning Healing Communities USA. We do want to pause for a minute and just kind of address an element that's kind of floating in the air. Dr. Trulier, he did mention that he had a cold and he wasn't feeling well. And then we saw an interesting thing in the video that made, I'm sure, quite a few people alarmed. It certainly alarmed me. I reached out to his community in DC. That's where he is. He teaches on the faculty also at Howard University. I've reached out to his colleagues who are doing a wellness check on him. So he has not gone unattended. When I stepped off, that was me checking in. And this is the value of community. You got to be able to call people. You got to be able to call people. So know that he is being attended to. And we ask that you join us in praying that he is okay, you know, that he's all right and that he will get the help that he needs. With that, we just have a few more minutes left. Barbara, do you think it's a good idea? I don't have anything else to add. I think we're going to say a final goodbye, but first, before we do, we'd like to offer our guests, Cindy and Aislinn, an opportunity. If you have a final word, you've spoken so much and so beautifully, that's fine too. If you're like, no, I said it all, but we do want to offer you all the opportunity to have a final word before we close out.
I would like to just recommend 2 readings if people are interested. One is the book Solitary by Albert Woodfox, who's the person that I mentioned who had experienced 40 years of solitary confinement and was released about 2 years ago. So Albert Woodfox, Solitary. And another book by Cindy, help me with the name. The founder of GS.
Stacey Hine?
Yes. Stacey Hine, called The Politics of Trauma. So I think those are 2 book recommendations.
I second those book recommendations. And I think I just would love to leave with an invitation. Like, I think what we've described, and particularly in our model as the Heal, Dismantle, Create, we know that we can't create this new liberatory future for ourselves alone, right, in a bubble of just the center. And we invite all of you to be co-creators, co-thought partners in the work. You can follow us on Facebook. We're about to launch a Love-a-thon for Justice sometime at the end of this month, and there'll be a 6-week calendar of liberatory practices starting in November 9th that you're invited to participate with us in. So really just the more people in our community, the more impact we're able to have, and the more folks we're able to be in community with and get their brilliance in the work. So the invitation is my last word.
Thank you so much. I just heard from a colleague in DC, and they are checking on Dr. Trulier, and he's okay. I'm not quite sure what happened in that moment, but they have an eye and a hand on him. Also want to bring your attention to, for those who are normally with us for the Trauma Symposium, as well as those who are joining us from McCormick Days at 2 o'clock. We ask you all to continue to be with us, for the State of McCormick address that will start at 2 o'clock. Same link as earlier today. For those who normally only join us for the Trauma Symposium, you're welcome to go over to the McCormick site and gather the link for McCormick Days to join us for the McCormick Days State of McCormick address. And I can't believe it, Barbara. This is it.
We've done it.
We have been rocking and rolling and reeling with this beautiful community since April. This is our final session of the Trauma Symposium. I want to publicly and personally thank the Reverend Dr. Barbara A. Wilson for her partnership in this work. She has been an excellent mentor, friend, and colleague, and collaborator on this project. I am so grateful for the Chicago Presbytery and their commitment to this work since April. That's a commitment. And I also want to thank Cindy and Aislinn from the Chicago Torture Justice Center. I've had the pleasure of getting to know them over the last few months and joining them in the work of politicized healing and grief, and I have learned greatly And I'm just grateful to our gathered community, McCormick Theological Seminary, Nanette Banks, the Director of Community Engagement, and also our President, David Crawford, who has saw fit to often join us for the Trauma Symposium. And also I want to thank our faculty and the Dean of the faculty, Steve Davidson, for their support and engagement, and more than anything, the gathered community. We appreciate the opportunity to come and be with you several times since April. I don't even remember how many we've done, but those are my thanks, and I want to hand it over to Barbara to close us out.
Well, ditto to all of the thank yous, and certainly to the Reverend Susan Crummell, the Executive Presbyter of Chicago Presbytery, and all of the leaders who have joined the effort. This is a part of our mental health initiative, and as a presbytery, and we are glad to serve the communities, including our partner, McCormick Theological Seminary, of which I am a double alumnus. So with that, see y'all again soon in another forum. Thank you to everyone. Blessings. Take care. Be well.
Take good care.